2 years of marriage without touching her, until love finally awakened. Welcome, dear soul, to a tale woven from the silk threads of longing and the cotton fields of the antebellum South. Today I invite you into a world where magnolia blossoms carry secrets, where silence speaks louder than words, and where love blooms in the most unexpected gardens of the heart. In just moments, you'll witness a story that transcends time, a reminder that true connection requires courage, that understanding demands patience, and that the greatest love stories are often born from the ashes of misunderstanding. This is not merely a tale of two hearts, but a testament to the transformative power of seeing beyond the surface, beyond convention, beyond fear itself. Before we begin this journey together, I'm curious, where in this beautiful world are you joining us from tonight? Whether you're nestled in a cozy corner of London, watching from the bustling streets of São Paulo, or perhaps gazing at stars from somewhere entirely unexpected, know that this story travels across all borders to reach your heart. If this tale moves you as much as it has moved me in its telling, please consider subscribing to join our literary family and leave a like to help these stories reach other hearts yearning for beauty and meaning. Now let us step through the veil of time itself. Charleston, South Carolina, summer of 1845. The Beaumont Manor stood like a monument to Southern grandeur against the amber sky of dawn, its towering white columns catching the first whispers of sunlight. But within its majestic walls, silence had built its own architecture, corridors of unspoken words, rooms furnished with careful distance, and staircases that echoed with the measured footsteps of two souls living as strangers. Catherine Hamilton Beaumont moved through her morning ritual with the precision of a clockwork figure. At precisely 6 o'clock, she descended the grand staircase, her silk slippers whispering against mahogany steps, worn smooth by generations of Beaumont feet. The morning dress of pale blue cotton hugged her 18-year-old frame, its high neckline and long sleeves a fortress against intimacy as much as modesty. In the breakfast room, Sarah had already prepared the delicate China tea service, jasmine tea in the pot painted with Charleston roses, honey in the crystal dish, cream in the silver pitcher that had belonged to Theodore's grandmother. Catherine sat in her designated chair, the one facing the gardens, while Theodore's chair remained empty. It would remain so until 6:30, when duty would summon him to his own solitary breakfast. The ritual had repeated itself for 730 mornings, 2 years of marriage, 2 years of parallel lives that never intersected except at the precise moments demanded by social propriety. Through the tall windows, Catherine watched the mist rise from the cotton fields like the ghosts of conversations never had. Somewhere beyond those endless white rows, Theodore was already moving among his domain, 300 acres, 300 enslaved souls, and one wife who might as well have been carved from the same marble as the manor's statues. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6:30. Catherine's hand paused above her teacup as familiar footsteps approached the breakfast room. Theodore entered with his usual formal bearing, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark hair impeccably groomed despite the early hour. At 28, he carried himself with the authority of a man who had inherited not just land, but legacy. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice as polite and distant as it had been on their wedding day. "Good morning, sir," Catherine replied, her own voice a mirror of his courtesy. And with those words, their daily conversation ended before it had truly begun. Theodore took his seat, Sarah served his coffee black, and his eggs prepared exactly as his tutor had taught him to prefer in childhood, over easy with a precise dash of salt. He unfolded the Charleston Courier with the careful movements of a man who had learned to fill silence with purpose. Catherine finished her tea and rose to begin her own day of beautiful emptiness. She would spend the morning hours in the music room, her fingers finding solace on the ivory keys of the grand piano. The melancholy strains of Chopin would fill the house like prayers, whispered in a language only the walls could understand. In the afternoon, she would sit in the garden pavilion with her embroidery, creating intricate flowers with silk threads, while real blossoms bloomed and died around her, untouched and unnoticed. As she moved toward the door, Catherine felt the weight of Theodore's gaze upon her, a sensation that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She paused, wondering if today might be different, if today might bring words beyond the morning's empty exchange. But when she turned, he had already returned to his newspaper, his face hidden behind news of cotton prices and political debates that seemed infinitely more worthy of his attention than the woman who shared his name. The silence stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm, and Catherine wondered, not for the first time, if she would spend her entire life as a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence. 2 years later, as autumn painted the South Carolina landscape in shades of amber and gold, the silence of Beaumont Manor was broken by an event as unexpected as thunder in a clear sky. Catherine was in the music room, her fingers dancing across the piano keys in a melancholy waltz, when she heard footsteps approaching, not the measured steps of Sarah or the hurried pace of the household staff, but Theodore's deliberate stride. The music died beneath her fingers as he appeared in the doorway, holding an envelope of cream-colored paper, sealed with burgundy wax. For a moment, they regarded each other across the gulf of 2 years' silence, and Catherine noticed details she had forgotten how to see, the way Theodore's dark eyes held flecks of gold in the afternoon light, the slight cleft in his chin that gave his serious face an unexpected vulnerability. "Mrs. Beaumont," he began, then stopped, as if the formal address tasted bitter on his tongue. "Catherine." Her name fell from his lips like a prayer long forgotten. "I have received an invitation that concerns us both." Catherine's hands folded in her lap, her spine straightening with the posture drilled into her by years at the Savannah Female Seminary. "Yes, Mr. Beaumont. Governor Hammond is hosting a reception in Charleston next week. The invitation specifically requests our attendance. Together." Theodore stepped into the room and Catherine caught the scent of tobacco and sandalwood that always seemed to surround him. "It appears our arrangement has been noticed by Charleston society." The word arrangement hung between them like a blade. Catherine rose from the piano bench, her afternoon dress of forest green silk rustling in the quiet room. "I see. And you require an ornamental wife for the occasion." Something flickered across Theodore's features, surprise perhaps, or pain. "I require—" He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. "Your presence would be appreciated." "By whom?" The question escaped before Catherine could stop it, carrying 2 years of suppressed emotion in its wake. Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "By me." The admission settled between them like ash from a distant fire. Catherine felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. "Very well. I shall accompany you to Charleston. We would depart Thursday morning. The carriage ride is approximately 2 hours." Theodore's voice had regained its formal cadence, but Catherine detected an underlying current she couldn't quite name. "You may wish to prepare accordingly." As he turned to leave, Catherine found herself speaking again. Theodore. His given name felt foreign on her tongue after so long. "Why now? Why, after all this time, do you wish for my company?" He paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. When he turned back, his eyes held a depth that took her breath away. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "because I have finally realized what I have been missing." The words followed Catherine through the remainder of the afternoon like whispered secrets. As she selected gowns with Sarah's help, as she sat for dinner alone while Theodore attended to business in Charleston, as she lay wakeful in her solitary bed that night, she felt the first stirrings of something she had thought buried forever. Hope was a dangerous thing in a heart that had learned to live without it. The carriage wheels sang against the cobblestones of Charleston as they approached the governor's mansion, a palatial structure adorned with gas lamps that turned the evening into a constellation of golden stars. Catherine smoothed the silk of her evening gown, a creation of midnight blue that had arrived from Paris before her marriage, unworn until this night. The bodice was adorned with seed pearls that caught the lamplight like captured starshine, and the skirt fell in graceful folds that whispered secrets with every movement. Theodore sat across from her in the carriage, resplendent in his evening attire. The severe black of his tailcoat emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, while the white of his shirt collar provided a stark contrast to his olive complexion. Throughout the 2-hour journey, their conversation had been limited to observations about the weather and the passing landscape. But Catherine had caught him watching her, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in ways she had almost forgotten. The governor's mansion blazed with hundreds of candles, their light spilling from every window like liquid gold. As their carriage joined the procession of elegant vehicles delivering Charleston's elite to the evening's festivities, Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with social anxiety and everything to do with the man beside her. "Mrs. Beaumont," Theodore said as the carriage door was opened by a liveried footman, "you look—" He paused, seeming to search for words that had deserted him. "Extraordinary." The compliment, simple as it was, sent warmth spreading through Catherine's chest. As Theodore handed her down from the carriage, his touch lingered on her gloved fingers, a moment of contact that seemed to burn through silk and skin to her very soul. The mansion's interior was a symphony of southern grandeur, crystal chandeliers that scattered rainbow light across walls, lined with portraits of distinguished ancestors, marble floors that reflected the dancers like a still pond, and the sweet perfume of magnolia and jasmine that drifted from elaborate floral arrangements. Catherine found herself the center of attention in ways she had never experienced. Gentlemen bowed over her hand with genuine admiration. Their wives complimented her gown and her French accent when she conversed with visiting diplomats from New Orleans. She discussed literature with a professor from the College of Charleston, shared insights about European politics with a cotton merchant who had recently returned from Liverpool, and found herself defending the merits of female education with a passion that surprised even herself. "Your wife is quite remarkable, Beaumont," observed Colonel Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and keen blue eyes. "I had not realized the extent of her accomplishments." Theodore's gaze found Catherine across the ballroom, where she was engaged in animated conversation with Augustus Miller, a young lawyer recently graduated from Harvard. Something flickered in Theodore's dark eyes. Pride, perhaps, but also something more complex. "Nor had I," he admitted quietly. As the evening progressed, Catherine became aware of Theodore's attention like a physical presence. When she danced with other gentlemen, the governor himself, Colonel Whitmore, the charming Mr. Miller, she felt Theodore's eyes following her movements. When she played the piano for the assembled guests, her fingers finding their way through a complex Chopin nocturne, she played not for the applauding audience, but for the silent figure who stood in the shadows. His face transformed by an expression she had never seen before. It was Augustus Miller, who finally brought the evening's undercurrents to the surface. Young, handsome, and possessed of the easy confidence that came with Harvard education and family wealth, he had monopolized Catherine's attention for the better part of an hour. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said as they stood together on the mansion's moonlit terrace, "forgive my boldness, but I find myself compelled to say that your husband is the most fortunate man in Charleston." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You are too kind, Mr. Miller. I am truthful," he replied, stepping closer. "A woman of your intelligence and grace deserves to be treasured, not merely possessed." The words hung in the night air like the scent of jasmine, sweet, intoxicating, and dangerous. Before Catherine could respond, she heard familiar footsteps on the terrace stones. "Miller," Theodore's voice cut through the night with the precision of a blade. "I believe the governor is looking for you." Augustus straightened, his jaw setting with youthful defiance. "Beaumont, I was just telling your lovely wife how fortunate you are." "Indeed." Theodore's tone was silk over steel. "Fortunate beyond measure." The two men regarded each other for a long moment, the air between them crackling with tension. Finally, Augustus bowed to Catherine with elaborate courtesy. "Mrs. Beaumont, it has been an honor." As the young lawyer departed, Catherine found herself alone with her husband beneath the Charleston stars. The silence stretched between them, heavy with words unspoken and emotions unnamed. "We should return to the ballroom," Catherine said finally. "Should we?" Theodore stepped closer, and Catherine caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker. Jealousy, perhaps, or desire. Or should we finally speak the truth that has been burning between us all evening? Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "And what truth is that?" Theodore's hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "That I have been a fool. That I have wasted 2 years of our lives living like strangers when we could have been—" He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "When we could have been discovering what we might become together." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. But before Catherine could respond, the terrace doors opened and other guests spilled out into the night, their laughter and conversation shattering the intimate moment like glass. The ride back to Beaumont Manor was conducted in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than they had shared before, electric with possibility and heavy with the weight of words that demanded to be spoken. The confrontation came the next morning in the garden behind Beaumont Manor, among the ancient magnolia trees that had witnessed 3 generations of family secrets. Catherine had risen early, unable to sleep after the previous evening's revelations, and had sought solace among the climbing roses and jasmine that perfumed the morning air with their sweet fragrance. She was cutting fresh blooms for the breakfast table when Theodore found her, his hair still damp from his morning wash, his white shirt open at the collar in a way that made her pulse quicken despite herself. In his hands he carried a single camellia, white as fresh snow, perfect as a prayer. "Catherine." Her name on his lips had lost its formal edge, becoming something softer, more intimate. "We need to speak." Catherine's hands stilled on the rose stems, her gardening shears forgotten. "Do we? About last night?" "About Miller." Theodore stepped closer, the camellia extended like an offering. "About the way you looked when he spoke to you." "And how did I look?" Catherine's chin lifted with a defiance that surprised them both. "Alive," Theodore said simply. "More alive than I have seen you in 2 years of marriage." The admission hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. Catherine set down her shears and turned to face him fully, her morning dress of yellow cotton bright as sunshine against the garden's green backdrop. "You want to know why I looked alive, Theodore?" Her voice carried 2 years of suppressed frustration and longing. "Because for the first time since our wedding day, someone spoke to me as if I had a mind worth engaging, thoughts worth hearing. Augustus Miller may be young and presumptuous, but he saw me as more than a decorative addition to his arm." Theodore's jaw tightened, and Catherine saw something she had never witnessed before, vulnerability naked and unguarded in his dark eyes. "Is that what you think? That I see you as merely decorative? What else am I to think?" Catherine's hands clenched at her sides, crushing the rose stems she still held. "You speak to me only when necessity demands it. You take your meals in solitude, conduct your business without consultation, live your life as if I were no more substantial than the portraits hanging in our hallway." "Because I am a coward," Theodore said, the words torn from him like a confession under torture. "Because you terrify me in ways I never expected, never prepared for." Catherine stared at him, speechless. "I terrify you?" Theodore stepped closer, near enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, smell the sandalwood soap he used for shaving. "You were 18 years old on our wedding day, Catherine. 18 and so beautiful it hurt to look at you. But more than that, you were educated, articulate, possessed of a mind that could match any gentleman's in debate. And he paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "I was a man who had been raised by tutors and governesses, shipped off to northern schools where emotion was considered weakness and expression was trained out of us like bad habits." Catherine felt something crack open in her chest, not her heart breaking, but the walls around it finally beginning to crumble. "So you decided to keep me at arm's length, rather than risk appearing weak." "I decided to protect you from my inadequacies," Theodore corrected softly. "What did I know of loving a woman like you? What did I know of being worthy of someone who could converse in French with diplomats and play Chopin as if the music flowed from her very soul?" The camellia trembled in his hand, its white petals catching the morning light like tears. "I know it was wrong, Catherine. I know I have been unfair to you, unfair to what we might have built together. But when I saw you last night, when I watched you come alive under another man's attention," Theodore's voice grew rough with emotion, "I realized that my cowardice was destroying the most precious thing I had ever been given." Catherine reached out slowly, her fingers closing around the camellia's stem. Their hands touched, and she felt the tremor that ran through him at the contact. "What are you saying, Theodore?" "I am saying that I want to begin again." His other hand rose to cup her cheek, the touch gentle as a prayer. "I am saying that I want to court my own wife, to discover who she is beneath the careful politeness we have maintained for 2 years. I am saying—" He paused, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I am saying that I think I could love you, Catherine Hamilton. Beaumont, if you would give me the chance to try." Catherine felt tears gather in her eyes, tears of relief, of hope, of something that might have been joy. The camellia crushed between their joined hands, its perfume rising like incense between them. "And I am saying," she whispered, "that I think I could love you too, Theodore Beaumont, if we both have the courage to let ourselves be real with each other." When he kissed her, there among the magnolia trees with the morning sun, painting everything golden, it was not the formal press of lips that had sealed their wedding vows. It was a promise of possibilities yet to be discovered, of conversations yet to be had, of love yet to be built from the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. The first real day of their marriage had finally begun. The transformation began with tea. The morning after their garden conversation, Catherine descended the stairs at her usual 6 o'clock to find Theodore already seated in the breakfast room, 2 cups prepared, steam rising from the jasmine tea like morning prayers. He rose when she entered, his movements formal but his eyes warm with something new. "Good morning, Catherine," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, softer, more intimate. "Good morning, Theodore." She took her usual seat, but everything felt changed, charged with new possibility. For the first time in 2 years, they shared their morning meal. Theodore asked about her plans for the day, and Catherine found herself describing her intention to work in the garden, to practice a new piece by Liszt, to correspond with her cousin in Savannah. He listened with an attention that made her feel seen, valued, understood. "I had not realized you maintained correspondence with your family," Theodore said, setting down his coffee cup with careful precision. "There is much you have not realized about me," Catherine replied, but without bitterness, "just as there is much I have not realized about you." Their eyes met across the table, And Theodore smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his entire face, erasing the severe lines and revealing the gentle man beneath the formal exterior. Then perhaps, he said, we should remedy that failing. So began a courtship unlike any other, a husband wooing his own wife with the careful attention of a suitor discovering his beloved's heart. Theodore brought her books from Charleston, volumes of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, novels by the Bronte sisters, treatises on botany and astronomy that sparked conversations lasting long into the evening. Catherine, in turn, shared the depths of her own education, the languages she spoke, the music she composed in private moments, the thoughts about politics and society that she had kept locked away for 2 years. They walked together in the evenings, exploring the grounds of Beaumont Manor as if seeing them for the first time. Theodore showed her the family cemetery, where his ancestors lay beneath weathered marble angels, told her stories of the grandmother who had planted the rose garden, the uncle who had designed the stables, where his prized horses still lived. Catherine shared memories of her childhood in Savannah, of the progressive school where she had learned to think and question and dream. Your education was quite different from mine, Theodore observed one evening, as they sat on the garden bench, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Different how? Catherine asked, settling her shawl more closely around her shoulders. You were taught to think for yourself. I was taught to think like my father, and his father before him. Theodore's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. Critical thinking was not encouraged in the Beaumont household. Conformity was. Catherine studied his profile in the starlight, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair caught silver highlights from the moon. Is that why you seem so distant? Because you were afraid to think differently? Perhaps. Theodore turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the stars above. Or perhaps because I was afraid that if you knew the real me, the man beneath the Beaumont name and fortune, you would find me wanting. And now? Catherine asked softly. Theodore reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that still sent warmth racing through her veins. Now I think I am ready to risk being known. Their physical intimacy developed slowly, built on the foundation of genuine affection and mutual respect. Conversations over morning tea became longer, more intimate. Evening walks stretched into hours spent talking under the stars. And gradually, carefully, they began to bridge the physical distance that had defined their marriage. The first time Theodore kissed her goodnight at her bedroom door, Catherine felt her heart stutter in her chest. The second time, she found herself leaning into the kiss, her hands rising to rest against his chest. The third time she whispered his name against his lips, and felt him tremble at the sound. Catherine, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. I want to be worthy of you. You already are, she whispered back. You always were. We were just too afraid to see it. But their happiness was fragile, built on such new foundations that Catherine sometimes woke in the night, wondering if it was all a beautiful dream that morning would dissolve. She would rise and go to the window, looking out at the cotton fields that stretched to the horizon, and wonder what secrets still lay between them, what truths still waited to be uncovered. She had no way of knowing that in Theodore's study, locked away in a drawer he thought she would never open, lay documents that could shatter their newfound joy like glass against stone. The revelation came during a visit to Grandmama Rose, Theodore's beloved childhood nurse, who now lived in a small cottage on the neighboring plantation. At 70 years old, Rose moved with the careful grace of someone who had carried the weight of countless secrets, her dark skin lined with years of experience, her eyes still sharp as broken glass. Mr. Teddy, she said, embracing Theodore with the freedom of someone who had loved him before he learned to build walls around his heart. You finally brought your missus to see me. Catherine found herself immediately charmed by the elderly woman who served tea in mismatched china cups and spoke to Theodore with the loving exasperation of a mother addressing a wayward child. The cottage was small but immaculate, filled with handmade quilts and the lingering scent of biscuits and garden herbs. Grandmama Rose practically raised me, Theodore explained as they sat around the worn wooden table. When my parents were away on business, when the tutors were too strict or the loneliness too much to bear, I would run to her cottage. That boy, Rose said, shaking her head with fond memory, always too serious even as a child, never wanted to play with the other children, always reading his books and watching the sky like he was looking for something that wasn't there. Catherine watched Theodore's face as Rose spoke, seeing new layers of understanding unfold. The formal distance, the careful control, these were not natural traits but learned behaviors, armor developed to protect a sensitive heart that had been shaped by isolation and duty from an early age. His mama and papa, Rose continued, her weathered hands wrapping around her teacup, they meant well, I suppose, but they thought raising a proper gentleman meant breaking the child's spirit first, then rebuilding it in their image. Sent him away to those northern schools when he was barely 10 years old. 10? Catherine turned to Theodore, seeing pain flicker across his features. The Beaumont men have always been educated at the finest institutions, Theodore said quietly. Harvard, Yale, Princeton. It was expected. Expected by whom? Catherine asked, but she thought she already knew the answer. By everyone. Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. By tradition, by society, by my father who had been raised the same way. A Beaumont man does not show weakness, does not indulge in sentiment, does not allow emotion to cloud his judgment. Rose made a sound of disgust. Foolishness, all of it. That boy needed love, not lectures. Needed someone to see his gentle heart, not try to harden it into something it was never meant to be. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine began to understand the man she had married with new clarity. Theodore had been trained from childhood to suppress his natural tenderness, to view emotional expression as failure, to see love as a luxury that men of his station could not afford. Her own education had been so different. At the Savannah Female Seminary, she had been encouraged to think, to feel, to express herself with confidence and grace. "Grandmama Rose," Catherine said as they prepared to leave, "may I ask you something?" "Course, child. What was Theodore like as a boy? Before the schools, before the training?" Rose's face softened with memory. "Sweet as summer honey. Used to bring me flowers from the garden every morning, tell me stories he made up about the stars. Had a laugh that could light up the darkest room." She glanced at Theodore, who had stepped away to examine a quilt hanging on the cottage wall. Still does when he forgets to be ashamed of it. That evening, as they walked back to the manor through fields silvered by moonlight, Catherine felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding, a more complete acceptance of who they each were beneath the roles society had assigned them. "I'm sorry," Theodore said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "For what?" "For being so afraid to let you see me." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Grandmama Rose was right. I was taught that showing my true self was a form of weakness, but hiding from you has been the greatest weakness of all." Catherine reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the slight roughness of his evening stubble beneath her palms. "We have both been hiding, Theodore, both been afraid. But we don't have to be afraid anymore." When he kissed her this time, it was with a passion that had been building for weeks of careful courtship. His arms encircled her waist, pulling her close against him, and Catherine felt the last of her reservations melt away like morning mist. "I love you," Theodore whispered against her lips, the words seeming to surprise him with their intensity. "God help me, Catherine. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "And I love you," she whispered back, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Not the man you thought you had to be, but the man you truly are." They made love that night for the first time as husband and wife who truly knew each other, their union finally based on genuine intimacy rather than duty or expectation. In the silver darkness of Catherine's bedroom, with the scent of jasmine drifting through open windows, they discovered each other's bodies with the wonder of lovers newly awakened to desire. But even in her happiness, Catherine could not entirely silence the small voice that whispered warnings in the back of her mind. Their love was so new, so fragile. What if there were other secrets waiting to surface? What if the foundations they were building were not as solid as they seemed? The answer would come sooner than she imagined, hidden in a drawer she was never meant to open. The discovery happened by accident, as the most devastating revelations often do. Catherine was looking for Theodore's reading glasses, which he had mislaid somewhere in his study while reviewing the plantation's financial records. She had offered to help search, and he had agreed with the easy intimacy that had developed between them over the past months. The study was Theodore's private domain, lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather. Catherine had rarely entered the room during their 2 years of estrangement, but now she moved through it with the comfortable familiarity of a wife welcomed into her husband's world. "Try the second drawer," Theodore called from across the room where he was examining papers near the window. "I sometimes put them there when I'm working on correspondence." Catherine pulled open the drawer, expecting to find the missing glasses among the usual collection of pens, sealing wax, and correspondence. Instead, her fingers encountered a leather portfolio tied with a black ribbon, the kind used for important legal documents. She might have ignored it entirely, might have simply searched beneath it for the glasses. if not for the fact that it bore her father's name, written in elegant script across the front. Hamilton-Beaumont marriage contract. Her heart seemed to stop beating entirely. With trembling fingers, Catherine untied the ribbon and opened the portfolio. The documents within were written in the precise legal language she recognized from her father's business correspondence, but the contents made her blood run cold. Marriage contract between Theodore James Beaumont and Catherine Rose Hamilton, executed this 15th day of September, 1845, for the consideration of land rights, debt assumption, and property consolidation. The words blurred before her eyes as the full meaning became clear. Their marriage had not been simply arranged for the convenience of their families. It had been a business transaction, complete with financial considerations and property transfers that made Catherine feel like livestock sold at market. Dowry consideration. Assumption of Hamilton family debt in the amount of $25,000, plus transfer of 200 acres of Hamilton cotton land to Beaumont Holdings. Conditions of contract. Production of male heir within 3 years of marriage to ensure property succession. In the event of failure to produce said heir, Hamilton properties to revert to Beaumont ownership in perpetuity. Catherine's hands shook as she read further, each clause revealing new depths of betrayal. Her father had essentially sold her to pay his gambling debts and failed business ventures. Theodore had acquired her along with her family's land and assets, like a particularly valuable piece of property. Catherine? Theodore's voice seemed to come from very far away. Did you find them? She looked up to find him approaching the desk, his face breaking into the smile that had become so precious to her over the past weeks. When he saw the documents in her hands, the smile died like a candle in the wind. Catherine, I can explain. Explain. Catherine's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the force of a scream. Explain how you bought me like a prize heifer. Explain how my father sold me to pay his debts. Theodore's face went pale. It wasn't like that, wasn't it? Catherine stood on unsteady legs, the contract papers scattering to the floor around her. $25,000 in debt assumption, plus land transfers, plus the promise of a male heir within 3 years. What was I, Theodore? What was I but a very expensive acquisition? You were never that to me, Theodore said, his voice desperate. Yes, the marriage was arranged for financial reasons, but you played your part beautifully. Catherine cut him off, backing away from him as if he were a stranger who had wandered into her home. The distant husband, the careful courtesy. Were you simply waiting to see if I would fulfill my breeding obligations before deciding whether I was worth the investment? Catherine, please. These past weeks, Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger as fury replaced shock, have they been part of your strategy? The courtship, the intimacy, the declarations of love? Was it all designed to secure your investment? No. Theodore reached for her, but she stepped away, her face a mask of pain and betrayal. Catherine, I love you. Whatever brought us together, I love you now with everything I am. Love? Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You don't know the meaning of the word. You know possession, you know acquisition, you know how to manage property. But love? Love requires honesty, Theodore. Love requires trust. She moved toward the door, her steps unsteady but determined. Theodore followed, his face a study in desperation. Where are you going? To Savannah, Catherine said without turning around. To my aunt's house. To somewhere I can think clearly without being surrounded by the evidence of my father's betrayal and your deception. Catherine, wait. But she was already gone, leaving Theodore alone in his study with the scattered papers of a contract that had just destroyed the most precious thing he had ever possessed. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the manor like a gunshot, followed by the frantic sounds of packing. Within the hour, Catherine's carriage was disappearing down the oak-lined drive, carrying away not just Theodore's wife, but his heart and any hope of happiness he had dared to imagine. Aunt Margaret's house on Madison Square was a refuge of gentle feminine sensibility, all soft pastels and delicate china, perfumed with the scent of roses and the sound of gentle conversation. Catherine's mother's sister had never married, dedicating her life instead to literature, charity work, and the care of various nieces and nephews who found themselves in need of sanctuary. For 7 days, Catherine remained in the guest room with its wallpaper of climbing vines and windows that looked out onto Savannah's most fashionable square. She barely ate, spoke only when courtesy demanded it, and spent long hours staring at nothing while her aunt tiptoed around her broken heart with the careful attention of a gardener tending wounded blooms. On the 3rd day, the letters began arriving. They came by messenger, courier, and personal delivery, thick packets sealed with the Beaumont family crest and written in Theodore's careful script. Aunt Margaret brought them to Catherine's room on a silver tray, like medicine that might cure what ailed her. "Dearest Catherine," the first letter began, "I know that words cannot undo the hurt I have caused, but I must try to make you understand." Catherine read the first paragraph, then burned the letter in the bedroom fireplace without finishing it. The second letter received the same treatment, as did the third and fourth, but the letters kept coming, and gradually their content began to change. Theodore stopped trying to explain or justify, and instead began simply telling her the truth about his feelings, about the man he had discovered himself to be through loving her. "I cannot eat," he wrote in the fifth letter. "I cannot sleep. The manor feels like a tomb without your laughter, without the sound of your piano, without the sight of you moving through the rooms like sunlight given form." It was Grandmama Rose who finally broke through Catherine's defenses. The elderly woman arrived on the sixth day, having made the journey from Charleston with the determination of someone on a mission of mercy. "Child," she said, settling herself in the chair beside Catherine's bed with the comfort of someone who had soothed countless broken hearts, "you running away from that boy ain't solving nothing." "I'm not running away," Catherine protested. "I'm protecting myself from further deception." "From what I can see," Rose replied with the bluntness of someone too old to waste time on polite fictions, "the only deception was in your own mind. You thought love was supposed to start with pretty words and romantic gestures, but sometimes love starts with duty and grows into something real." Catherine turned to face the window, unwilling to let Rose see the tears that threatened to fall. "He bought me, Grandmama Rose, like a piece of property." "Did he now?" Rose's voice carried the tone she had once used to correct Theodore's childhood misconceptions. "And what did he do with this property once he owned it?" "He ignored me for 2 years." "That's right, he did." Rose nodded with satisfaction, as if Catherine had just proved her point. "If all he wanted was a wife to breed like livestock, don't you think he would have been more attentive to that particular duty?" Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the elderly woman's bluntness. "Instead," Rose continued, "he kept his distance because he was scared of his own feelings. That boy has been taught his whole life that wanting something makes you weak, that caring makes you vulnerable. So when he found himself married to a woman who made him feel things he'd never felt before, he ran away from her faster than a scalded cat." "Then why court me now?" Catherine asked, her voice small. "Because he finally figured out that being scared was making him more miserable than being vulnerable ever could." Rose reached over and patted Catherine's hand with weathered fingers. "That contract you found, he told me about it. Also told me what he's done about it." Catherine turned to look at the elderly woman with questioning eyes. "He destroyed it," Rose said simply. "Bought back your daddy's debts from the bank, tore up the marriage contract, signed over the Hamilton lands to your family free and clear. His daddy's having fits about it, but Mr. Teddy don't care. He's willing to give up everything he thought he wanted to prove he loves you for who you are, not what you brought him." Catherine stared at Rose in shock. "He did what?" "Made himself poor for love," Rose said with a smile. "Just like a fairy tale, except messier and more expensive." That evening, Augustus Miller came to call. Still handsome, still charming, still possessed of the easy confidence that had attracted Catherine at the governor's ball. But now, seeing him in Aunt Margaret's parlor, with the distance of a week's reflection, Catherine recognized something she had missed before, a calculated quality to his attention, a practiced nature to his charm. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said, taking her hand with elaborate courtesy, "I was devastated to hear of your situation. Please know that you have my complete sympathy and support." "Thank you." "Mr. Miller," Catherine withdrew her hand gently, "your kindness is appreciated. I hope you will not think me presumptuous," Augustus continued, "but I wanted you to know that should you decide to pursue other options, you would not lack for supporters among Charleston society." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Catherine studied the young lawyer's face, seeing ambition beneath the sympathetic expression, calculation behind the concerned eyes. "Other options?" she asked quietly. "Divorce, while scandalous, is not impossible for a woman of your station, particularly given the circumstances." Augustus leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a fascinating legal puzzle. "With proper representation and sufficient cause, you could regain your freedom and with it your independence." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And you would be willing to provide such representation?" "I would consider it an honor," Augustus replied, his eyes bright with what Catherine now recognized as the gleam of a man who saw opportunity in another's pain. That night, alone in her room with the sounds of Savannah's evenings settling around her like a familiar lullaby, Catherine finally opened Theodore's most recent letter. "My dearest Catherine," it began, "I will not ask for your forgiveness, for I know I do not deserve it. I will not ask you to return, for I know I have forfeited the right to your presence. I ask only that you believe this one truth. I love you not for what you brought to our marriage, but for who you are. I love your intelligence, your strength, your grace under circumstances that would have broken a lesser woman. I love the way you play Chopin, as if the music flows from your very soul, the way you tend the roses with such gentle care, the way you light up a room simply by entering it. I have destroyed the contract that brought us together, because I want our life to be built on choice, not obligation. I have returned your family's property, because I want you to come back to me freely, not because you have nowhere else to go. If you choose to stay in Savannah, I will respect your decision. If you choose to return to Charleston, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your trust. But whatever you choose, know that you are loved completely, unconditionally, and forever. Theodore. Catherine read the letter 3 times before the tears came, not tears of anger or betrayal this time, but tears of recognition. She was crying for the man who had been so afraid of love that he had nearly lost it entirely, for the woman who had been so hurt by deception that she had almost thrown away something real and precious, and for the impossible complexity of human hearts that could hold love and fear in the same fragile space. The next morning she instructed Aunt Margaret to pack her bags. She was going home. Catherine arrived at Beaumont Manor as the sun was setting, painting the white columns of the house in shades of gold and rose. The carriage wheels crunched on the familiar gravel drive, and she could see Theodore waiting on the front steps, his figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the open doors. He looked thinner than when she had left a week ago, his clothes hanging slightly loose on his frame, his face bearing the marks of sleepless nights and worried days. When the carriage stopped, he made no move to approach, clearly uncertain of his welcome. Catherine stepped down from the carriage herself, waving away the footman's assistance. For a long moment, she and Theodore regarded each other across the space that separated them, a distance that felt like both miles and inches. "Catherine," he said finally, her name a prayer on his lips. "Theodore." She moved closer, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in his dark eyes. "We need to talk." They walked to the garden in silence, to the bench where they had shared their first real conversation months ago. The magnolia trees were in bloom, their white petals glowing like stars in the gathering dusk, and the air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and roses. "Grandmama Rose came to see me," Catherine said without preamble. Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't ask her to, I know. She came because she loves you, and because she was worried that I might make a decision I would regret for the rest of my life." Catherine turned to face him, studying his profile in the fading light. "She told me what you did, about the contract, about the debts, about the land. I should have done it 2 years ago," Theodore said quietly. "I should have done it the moment I realized what kind of man I wanted to be. Why didn't you?" Theodore was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid that if I destroyed the only thing that bound you to me, you would leave. And I wasn't ready to lose you, even if it meant I could never truly have you." Catherine felt her heart crack open at the raw honesty in his voice. "And now? Now I know that love without choice isn't love at all. It's possession." Theodore turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "I would rather lose you to your own free will than keep you through obligation." Catherine reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the familiar warmth that had become so precious to her. "Then you should know," she said softly, "that I choose to be here. I choose you, Theodore Beaumont, not because of any contract or obligation, but because I love the man you are when you're brave enough to be yourself." The kiss that followed was different from any they had shared before, deeper, more desperate, filled with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing each other entirely. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together in the gathering darkness. "I have something to tell you," Catherine whispered against his lips. "What?" "I'm carrying your child." Theodore went very still, his hands tightening on hers. "Catherine, I realized just before I left for Savannah, but I was too angry, too hurt to tell you then." Catherine's voice was soft but sure. "I wanted you to know that this child was conceived in love, not as part of any contract or obligation. This baby is the result of choice, Theodore, our choice to trust each other, to be vulnerable with each other." Theodore's hands moved to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. Are you happy about it?" "I'm terrified," Catherine admitted with a shaky laugh, "and thrilled, and grateful. This baby is proof that we found our way to each other, despite everything that tried to keep us apart." When Theodore kissed her this time, Catherine could taste tears on his lips. Whether his or hers, she couldn't tell. It didn't matter. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a love finally given room to grow without the shadow of deception hanging over it. That night, they made love with a passion that was both desperate and tender, reaffirming their commitment to each other and to the new life growing between them. In the silver darkness of their bedroom, no longer just Catherine's room but truly theirs, they whispered promises and plans, hopes and dreams for the future they would build together. "I love you," Theodore murmured against her hair as they lay entwined in the aftermath of passion. "I love you and I love the child you carry, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice in coming back to me." "I love you too," Catherine whispered back, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly where new life grew. "And I think our child is going to be very lucky to have you as a father." As sleep finally claimed them, Catherine felt a peace she had never known before, the peace that comes from being truly known and loved for exactly who you are. The contract that had brought them together was gone, but the bond they had forged in its place was infinitely stronger. Their real marriage had finally begun. 6 months later, the chapel bells of Beaumont Manor rang out across the cotton fields like silver laughter carried on the spring wind. Catherine stood before the altar, in a gown of ivory silk that accommodated the gentle curve of her pregnancy, her hands holding a bouquet of white roses and jasmine from her own garden. Beside her, Theodore wore his finest black tailcoat, his dark hair gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the chapel's stained glass windows. The renewal of their vows was a small, intimate affair, nothing like the grand ceremony that had united them 2.5 years ago in obligation and duty. This time, the chapel held only those who truly mattered. Grandmama rose in the front pew, her weathered face bright with joy. Aunt Margaret, who had traveled from Savannah with tears already sparkling in her eyes, a handful of trusted friends and neighboring families who had watched their love story unfold with fascination and hope. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Matthews, the elderly Episcopal minister who had baptized Theodore as an infant and married his parents before him, "we gather today not to witness the beginning of a marriage, but to celebrate its true consummation, built not on contract or convenience, but on the sacred foundation of mutual love, respect, and choice." Catherine felt Theodore's hand tighten around hers, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in the gentle gesture that had become their private language of comfort and connection. At 7 months pregnant, she carried their son with the grace of a woman who had embraced both her vulnerability and her strength, her body a testament to the new life they had created together in love. When it came time for the vows, Theodore turned to face her fully, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Catherine," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the small chapel, "I take you now as I should have taken you then, not as an acquisition or an obligation, but as my equal, my partner, my beloved. I promise to see you, to hear you, to honor the remarkable woman you are. I promise to love not just your beauty, but your mind, your spirit, your fierce independence, that first terrified and then captivated me." Catherine felt her own tears spill over as she responded. "Theodore, I choose you now with full knowledge of who you are, not the man you thought you had to be, but the man you truly are beneath all the fear and careful control. I promise to love your gentle heart, to encourage your dreams, to stand beside you as we build a life based on truth and trust and the courage to be vulnerable with each other." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife in the truest sense of those sacred words, the kiss they shared was witnessed by 40 guests, but felt like the most private moment of their lives, a seal upon promises made not from duty but from desire, not from obligation but from choice. The reception took place on the manor's grand veranda, with tables laid in white linen and adorned with arrangements of magnolia blossoms and jasmine. A string quartet from Charleston played beneath the ancient oak trees, their music mixing with the laughter of guests and the gentle evening sounds of the plantation. Catherine moved through the celebration with the radiant contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. She accepted congratulations with grace, shared stories of their courtship with friends who marveled at the transformation of both bride and groom, and danced with Theodore to a waltz that seemed written specifically for them. "You're glowing," Aunt Margaret observed, as Catherine paused to rest on a chair brought onto the veranda for her comfort. "I'm happy," Catherine replied simply, her hand resting on her rounded belly where young Theodore James Beaumont Jr. kicked with the enthusiasm of someone eager to join the celebration. "It shows, darling. You both look like completely different people than you were at your first wedding." Catherine followed her aunt's gaze to where Theodore stood with a group of neighboring planters, his face animated as he discussed new agricultural techniques he had learned from his correspondence with progressive farmers in Virginia. Gone was the stiff formality that had once defined him. In its place was a man comfortable in his own skin, confident in his convictions, unafraid to show enthusiasm for his interests. "We are different people," Catherine agreed. "We're who we were always meant to be, once we stopped being afraid of each other." As the evening deepened and the last guests departed with promises to visit again soon, Catherine and Theodore found themselves alone on the veranda, the manor glowing warmly behind them, the sound of their staff quietly clearing away the celebration's remnants. "No regrets?" Theodore asked, settling beside her on the swing that hung from the veranda's ceiling. "None," Catherine replied without hesitation. "What about you?" Theodore pulled her closer, his arm encircling her shoulders as their child moved restlessly between them. "Only that it took us so long to find our way to each other." "But we did find our way," Catherine pointed out, leaning into his warmth. "And perhaps the waiting made us appreciate it more." They swung gently in the evening air, watching stars emerge in the sky above the cotton fields, listening to the sounds of night settling over their domain. Tomorrow would bring the usual responsibilities, the plantation to manage, letters to write, preparations to make for their son's arrival. But tonight, they simply held each other and marveled at the miracle of two hearts that had learned to beat in harmony. "Catherine," Theodore's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, thank you. For what?" "For coming back. For giving us another chance. For choosing love even when it would have been easier to choose safety." Catherine turned in his arms, her hands framing his face in the starlight. "Thank you for being brave enough to change. For being willing to tear up a contract for love. For showing me that happy endings are possible even when they seem impossible." Their kiss was gentle, unhurried, a promise of all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them. And as young Theodore kicked against his mother's ribs, as if reminding them of the future they were creating together, both parents laughed with the pure joy of people who had found their way home. 10 months after their wedding renewal, as autumn painted the South Carolina landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Theodore Hamilton Beaumont, Jr. made his entrance into the world with the same dramatic flair that had characterized his parents' love story. He arrived during a thunderstorm, his first cries mixing with the sound of rain against the windows of the master bedroom, as if nature itself was celebrating his birth. Catherine held their son against her chest, while Theodore sat beside the bed, his large hand gentle on the baby's dark head. Young Teddy, as Grandmama Rose had already begun calling him, had inherited his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, along with a set of lungs that proclaimed his presence with unmistakable authority. "He's perfect," Theodore whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "He's ours," Catherine corrected softly. "Really, truly ours." The months that followed young Teddy's birth brought changes to Beaumont Manor that transformed it from a showplace of southern grandeur into a genuine home. The formal drawing rooms echoed with laughter and music. The gardens bloomed with the flowers Catherine tended, while her son napped in a basket beside her. The library became a place where husband and wife spent evening hours reading aloud to each other and planning improvements to their plantation. Theodore had thrown himself into agricultural innovation, with the passion of a man finally free to pursue his interests without fear of judgment. He corresponded with progressive farmers throughout the South and as far away as England, implementing new crop rotation techniques and soil conservation methods that increased both yield and sustainability. The Hamilton Beaumont Cotton Company, as they had formerly renamed their combined holdings, became known throughout Charleston for both its quality cotton and its forward-thinking management. Catherine, for her part, had discovered a gift for the business side of their enterprise. Her education in French proved invaluable when negotiating with textile merchants from New Orleans, while her mathematical skills, carefully hidden during her years at the Savannah Female Seminary, made her an excellent partner in managing their accounts and investments. "I never imagined," Theodore told her one evening, as they reviewed the plantation's books together, young Teddy sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, "that marriage could be such a true partnership." "Nor did I," Catherine admitted, looking up from the correspondence she was translating from their French cotton buyers. "I thought I would spend my life as an ornament in your household. Instead, I find myself more myself than I've ever been." Their success was not without challenges. Theodore's father had indeed been furious about the dissolution of the original marriage contract, going so far as to threaten disinheritance, before eventually accepting that his son's happiness and the plantation's prosperity mattered more than his wounded pride. Catherine's father had taken longer to come to terms with his daughter's independence but the sight of his grandson had softened even his stubborn heart. The social circles of Charleston had watched their transformation with fascination and in some cases envy. The couple who had once moved through society like polite strangers now entered every gathering as equal partners, their obvious affection and mutual respect setting a new standard for what marriage could be when built on genuine foundation. "So you've started something," Aunt Margaret observed during one of her visits, watching Catherine and Theodore dance together at a neighbor's house party. "Half the young wives in Charleston are demanding that their husbands actually talk to them about business and politics, and half the young husbands are discovering that their wives have minds worth engaging," Catherine replied with satisfaction. But it was the small private moments that truly revealed the depth of their transformation. Theodore singing French lullabies to young Teddy, while Catherine worked in the garden. Catherine reading agricultural journals aloud, while Theodore calculated crop yields. The way they moved together through their days like dancers who had finally learned each other's steps. One evening, as they sat on their veranda, watching the sunset paint the cotton fields in shades of gold, Catherine reflected on how far they had traveled from those first silent breakfasts. "Do you remember?" she asked, shifting young Teddy to her other arm as he nursed, "when you said you thought you could love me if I gave you the chance?" "I remember," Theodore replied, his hand stroking his son's downy hair. "It seems naive now, doesn't it? Thinking love was something that might happen, rather than something that had to happen. Do you think we would have found our way to each other without the crisis? Without the contract revelation forcing us to be honest?" Theodore considered this, his dark eyes thoughtful in the fading light. "I think love has a way of making itself known eventually. Perhaps it would have taken longer. Perhaps we would have spent years dancing around each other's hearts. But I believe we would have found each other, Catherine. Some connections are too strong to remain buried forever." As if sensing his parents' contemplation, young Teddy chose that moment to release his mother's breast and turn his dark eyes toward his father, his tiny fist reaching toward Theodore's face with the absolute trust of a child who had never known anything but love. "Our son will never doubt his place in our hearts," Catherine said softly, adjusting her bodice as Theodore took the baby into his arms. "No," Theodore agreed, holding his son against his chest where the infant settled with a contented sigh. "He'll grow up knowing what it looks like when two people choose each other every day. He'll understand that love is both gift and choice, blessing and responsibility. And perhaps," Catherine added with a smile, "he'll be wise enough to choose love the first time, rather than taking years to find his courage." Theodore laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. "Perhaps. Though I find myself almost grateful for our struggle, strange as that sounds. Easy love might not have taught us to treasure what we've built." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, and young Teddy drifted into sleep in his father's arms, Catherine and Theodore sat in comfortable silence, their bodies close together on the swing that had become their favorite place for evening reflection. Tomorrow would bring its own joys and challenges, business to conduct, decisions to make, a growing child to nurture and guide. But tonight, there was only this: the perfect weight of their son in Theodore's arms, the warmth of Catherine's hand in his free one, and the quiet satisfaction of two people who had learned that the greatest adventures were not found in distant lands, but in the daily choice to love and be loved completely. The Hamilton-Beaumont legacy would be measured not just in acres of cotton or profits from trade, but in the love that had transformed two frightened strangers into partners for life. 2 years had passed since young Teddy's birth, and the autumn of 1850 found the Hamilton-Beaumont plantation at the height of its prosperity. The cotton harvest stretched before them like a sea of white gold, the result of Theodore's innovative farming techniques and the favorable weather that had blessed their fields throughout the growing season. Catherine stood on the manor's front veranda, her second pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her morning dress of deep green wool. In her arms, she held 18-month-old Teddy, who babbled contentedly as he pointed at the workers moving through the distant fields. Theodore was somewhere among those fields, supervising the harvest with the hands-on approach that had made him respected by both his workforce and his peers. "Mama, Papa!" young Teddy called out, though his father was too far away to hear. "Papa is working, sweetheart," Catherine murmured, pressing a kiss to her son's dark hair. "But he'll be home for dinner." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the drive, where a rider approached at a leisurely pace. Catherine recognized the elegant figure of Elizabeth Whitmore, wife of Colonel Whitmore, and one of Charleston's most influential hostesses. Her visit was unexpected but not unwelcome. Elizabeth had become a genuine friend during the social season, one of the few society wives who appreciated Catherine's intellectual interests. "Catherine, my dear," Elizabeth called as she dismounted with the help of a groom. "I hope you don't mind an unannounced visit, but I simply had to share my news immediately." "Of course not," Catherine replied, settling young Teddy on her hip as she descended the veranda steps to greet her friend. "Please come in. Sarah has just prepared fresh tea." They settled in the morning room, where the afternoon light filtered through tall windows that looked out on Catherine's prized rose garden. Young Teddy played contentedly on the carpet with his wooden blocks, while the two women caught up on the latest Charleston gossip and news. "You're positively glowing," Elizabeth observed, stirring honey into her tea. "Pregnancy agrees with you beautifully." "Thank you," Catherine replied, her hand unconsciously moving to her still small belly. "We're hoping for a daughter this time, though Theodore claims he'll be equally happy with another son." "And how does young Master Theodore feel about the prospect of a sibling?" Catherine laughed, watching her son attempt to stack his blocks into an increasingly precarious tower. "He's far too young to understand, but he seems to enjoy the extra attention from his father. Theodore has been reading to him every evening, Shakespeare no less." "How wonderfully unconventional," Elizabeth said with approval. "Speaking of unconventional, that brings me to my news. The Ladies' Literary Society has voted unanimously to invite you to present a paper at our next quarterly meeting." Catherine nearly choked on her tea. "Present a paper?" "On the education of women specifically. Your own experience at the Savannah Female Seminary, combined with your obvious success in managing business affairs alongside your husband, makes you uniquely qualified to address the topic." Elizabeth leaned forward with enthusiasm. "We're hoping to influence some of the younger families in Charleston to consider more progressive education for their daughters." Catherine felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. The Ladies' Literary Society was composed of the most influential women in Charleston society, wives of politicians, judges, wealthy merchants. To be invited to address them was both an honor and a responsibility. "I would be delighted," Catherine said finally, "though I confess I'm somewhat nervous about speaking publicly." "Nonsense," Elizabeth waved away her concerns. "You've been managing conversations with cotton merchants and textile buyers for 2 years now. A room full of ladies should present no challenge." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of familiar footsteps on the veranda, followed by Theodore's voice greeting the servants. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, his white shirt rolled up at the sleeves and his dark hair slightly disheveled from the day's work in the fields. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with a smile, moving to kiss Catherine's cheek before sweeping young Teddy up into his arms. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Mr. Beaumont," Elizabeth replied with the slight blush that Theodore's presence seemed to inspire in most of Charleston's ladies. "I was just discussing literary matters with your remarkable wife." "Ah," Theodore's eyes twinkled as he looked at Catherine. "Another of her many talents that continues to surprise and delight me." The easy affection between husband and wife was palpable, and Elizabeth watched them with the fascination of someone observing a rare and beautiful phenomenon. In Charleston society, marriages like theirs, based on genuine partnership and obvious love, were uncommon enough to be remarkable. After Elizabeth's departure, Catherine shared the news of the invitation while Theodore cleaned up from his day in the fields. She found him in their bedroom, washing the dust from his hands and face in the basin Sarah had prepared. "The Ladies' Literary Society?" Theodore paused in his washing, water dripping from his chin. "Catherine, that's a tremendous honor and a tremendous responsibility," Catherine replied, sitting on the edge of their bed while young Teddy explored the contents of his father's wardrobe. "What if I say something inappropriate? What if I offend someone important?" Theodore dried his hands and came to sit beside her, his arm encircling her waist. "Then you'll have given them something worth thinking about," he said simply. "Catherine, you have insights about education and women's capabilities that could genuinely help the next generation of Charleston daughters. Don't let fear of propriety silence truths that need to be spoken." Catherine leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his quiet confidence in her abilities. "Will you help me prepare the paper?" "Of course," Theodore replied, pressing a kiss to her temple, "though I suspect you'll need very little help. You've been preparing for this your entire life." That evening, after young Teddy had been fed and settled in his nursery, Catherine and Theodore sat together in the library, surrounded by books on education, philosophy, and women's rights that Catherine had been quietly collecting over the past few years. The paper she would present began to take shape as they discussed her ideas and experiences. "The key," Catherine mused, making notes on a sheet of paper, "is to frame women's education not as a threat to traditional roles, but as an enhancement of them. A well-educated woman makes a better wife, mother, and member of society, even when that education leads her to question those traditional roles, Theodore asked with a slight smile. Catherine looked up from her notes, meeting his eyes with a directness that still had the power to make his pulse quicken. Especially then. Questions lead to growth, Theodore. Challenge leads to strength. Look what happened to us when we finally stopped accepting our assigned roles and started choosing who we wanted to be. Theodore reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I think, he said softly, that Charleston society is about to discover what I learned 2 years ago, that Catherine Hamilton Beaumont is a force to be reckoned with. We'll see, Catherine replied, but her smile carried the confidence of a woman who had found her voice and was no longer afraid to use it. As they worked together into the evening, young Teddy's contented babbling drifting down from the nursery, and the second child growing quietly beneath Catherine's heart, both parents felt the deep satisfaction that came from building something meaningful together. Not just a marriage or a family, but a legacy of love, respect, and the courage to be authentically themselves. The harvest season would end soon, but the harvest of their love would continue for generations to come. The ballroom of the Charleston Hotel had been transformed for the Ladies' Literary Society's quarterly meeting, its crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across an audience of Charleston's most influential women. Catherine stood at the lectern, her notes arranged before her, her heart beating so rapidly she wondered if the audience could hear it above the rustle of silk and the soft murmur of conversation. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that accommodated her advancing pregnancy, while maintaining an air of authority and respectability. At 5 months she could no longer hide her condition, but she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had learned to embrace rather than apologize for her circumstances. In the front row, Aunt Margaret sat with an encouraging smile, while Elizabeth Whitmore presided over the gathering with the easy confidence of a woman accustomed to hosting Charleston's elite. Theodore had offered to attend, but Catherine had gently declined. This was something she needed to do alone, to prove to herself, as much as to anyone else, that she had found her own voice. "Ladies," Elizabeth began, rising to address the assembled crowd, "today we are honored to hear from Mrs. Catherine Hamilton Beaumont on the topic of the educated woman, asset or threat to Southern society." A murmur rippled through the audience at the provocative title. Mrs. Beaumont brings to this discussion not only her own exceptional education at the Savannah Female Seminary, but her unique experience as a wife and mother, who has successfully partnered with her husband in managing one of our region's most prosperous plantations. As Elizabeth took her seat, Catherine rose on unsteady legs, her hands gripping the lectern for support. She looked out at the sea of faces before her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile to the idea that a woman might have something meaningful to say about education and society. "Ladies," Catherine began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "I stand before you today not as an advocate for revolution, but as a witness to transformation. 3 years ago, I was considered well-educated by the standards of our society. I could speak French, play piano, embroider beautifully, and manage a household with grace and efficiency. Yet I felt," she paused, gathering courage, "I felt useless, ornamental, as if all my education was merely decorative coating on a piece of furniture designed to enhance a man's reputation rather than contribute meaningfully to the world." A shocked murmur rippled through the audience. Several ladies exchanged scandalized glances, while others leaned forward with interest. "But then," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger, "I discovered what happens when a woman's education is truly valued and utilized. When my husband began including me in discussions of our plantation's business, when he asked for my opinions on investments and agricultural innovations, when he recognized that my mathematical skills and language abilities were assets rather than curiosities, I became not less of a wife, but more of a partner." She gestured to her rounded belly with a slight smile. "As you can see, embracing my intellectual capabilities has not diminished my capacity for fulfilling traditional feminine roles. If anything, it has enhanced them. I am a better mother because I can teach my children to think critically. I am a better wife because I can contribute meaningfully to our family's prosperity. I am a better member of this community because I can engage with the complex issues that affect us all." Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of a prominent judge, raised her fan to get Catherine's attention. "Mrs. Beaumont, surely you don't suggest that all women should abandon their proper sphere to engage in business?" Catherine smiled, having anticipated this question. "On the contrary, Mrs. Pemberton, I suggest that the sphere of women's influence could be expanded rather than abandoned. A woman who understands economics can better manage her household budget. A woman who understands politics can better guide her son's civic education. A woman who understands science can better protect her family's health. She moved away from the lectern, her nervousness replaced by passion for her subject. We are not asking to abandon our roles as wives and mothers. We are asking to fulfill those roles with the full measure of our capabilities. We are asking to be partners rather than possessions, contributors rather than ornaments. Young Mrs. Harrison, recently married and known for her progressive views, spoke up from the middle of the room. But what of men who see educated women as a threat to their authority? Catherine's eyes softened with memory. I was fortunate to marry a man who eventually came to see my education as an asset rather than a threat. But not all of us will be so fortunate. That is why it is crucial that we educate our daughters and our sons to value intelligence and capability in all people, regardless of their sex. The questions came more rapidly now, some challenging, some supportive, all engaged. Catherine found herself defending her views on female education, discussing specific curriculum changes that could benefit young women, and addressing concerns about social disruption and changing family dynamics. "Mrs. Beaumont," called out Mrs. Drayton, the elderly widow of a former governor, "you speak eloquently, but what practical steps do you propose? How does Charleston society move from your ideals to actual change?" Catherine had been hoping for this question. "I propose that we establish a scholarship fund to send deserving young women to institutions like the Savannah Female Seminary, where they can receive education equal to what we provide our sons. I propose that we encourage the wives in our community to take active roles in their husbands' businesses and civic activities. And I propose that we model for our children what true partnership between men and women can look like." She paused, her hand resting on her belly where her second child stirred as if responding to her passion. "Most importantly, I propose that we stop treating education as a luxury for women and start recognizing it as a necessity for the future prosperity and stability of our society." The applause that followed was not universal, but it was substantial. As Catherine returned to her seat on unsteady legs, she felt Elizabeth Whitmore's hand squeeze her shoulder in approval. "Thank you, Mrs. Beaumont," Elizabeth said, rising to address the audience once more. "You have given us much to consider." As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, Catherine found herself surrounded by women eager to continue the discussion. Some wanted to know more about the Savannah Female Seminary's curriculum. Others shared their own frustrations with the limitations placed on their intellectual development. A few expressed interest in the scholarship fund Catherine had proposed. But it was the approach of Mrs. Pemberton that surprised Catherine most. The judge's wife, who had seemed most skeptical during the presentation, waited until the crowd around Catherine had dispersed before speaking. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said quietly, "you have given me much to think about. My daughter Mary is 16 now, and I had planned to finish her education with a year of finishing school. But perhaps," she paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "perhaps I should consider more substantial options." "The Savannah Female Seminary would be fortunate to have her," Catherine replied with genuine warmth. "And Mary would be fortunate to receive such education." Mrs. Pemberton nodded thoughtfully. "Your husband must be very proud of you." "He is," Catherine replied with a smile. "But more importantly, he sees me as an equal partner in building our life together. That, Mrs. Pemberton, is the greatest education of all." As Catherine made her way home through Charleston's cobblestone streets, her carriage windows open to the mild autumn air, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with social approval and everything to do with personal growth. She had found her voice, used it effectively, and perhaps planted seeds that would grow into opportunities for the next generation of Southern women. The sight of Beaumont Manor's white columns rising against the afternoon sky filled her with contentment. Home was not just a place anymore, but a partnership built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the courage to challenge convention when love demanded it. Theodore was waiting on the veranda, young Teddy in his arms, both of them watching for her return with the expectant joy of people who had learned that the best adventures were the ones they shared together. Christmas Eve, 1850, arrived with a dusting of snow rare enough in Charleston to seem like a gift from heaven itself. The windows of Beaumont Manor glowed with warm candlelight, and the scent of magnolia and pine filled the air as Catherine arranged the final touches on their Christmas celebration. Yet 7 months pregnant with their daughter, for Theodore had been right in his certainty that this child would be a girl, Catherine moved with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to balance expanding responsibilities with expanding family. Young Teddy, now a precocious 2-year-old with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, helped by handing her ornaments for the Christmas tree that Theodore had cut from their own woods. "Careful, sweetheart," Catherine murmured, as Teddy reached for a delicate glass angel. "Let Mama hang that one." Theodore entered the parlor carrying a tray of mulled wine and warm milk, his face bright with the contentment that had become his natural expression over the past few years. The formal distance that had once characterized his movements had been replaced by the easy comfort of a man at peace with himself and his place in the world. "How are my girls?" he asked, setting down the tray and wrapping his arms around Catherine from behind, his hands resting on her rounded belly where their daughter practiced what felt like a complicated dance. "Active," Catherine replied with a laugh as the baby delivered a particularly enthusiastic kick. "I think she's eager to join the celebration." "Another month," Theodore murmured, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot below Catherine's ear that never failed to make her pulse quicken. "Though I confess I'm looking forward to meeting our little Christmas miracle." They had chosen to call her Rose, after Grandmama Rose, who had done so much to bring them together, and Catherine Margaret after both her aunt and her own middle name. Rose Catherine Margaret Beaumont would enter the world surrounded by love and the certainty of her place in their hearts. The evening brought their traditional Christmas Eve gathering. Aunt Margaret from Savannah, Grandmama Rose from her cottage, and a handful of close friends who had become extended family over the years. The table groaned under the weight of Southern holiday traditions. Ham glazed with brown sugar and bourbon, sweet potato casserole topped with pecans, green beans cooked with fatback, and cornbread stuffing that carried the flavors of Catherine's childhood. As they gathered around the table, Theodore rose to offer the blessing that had become his Christmas tradition. "Lord," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the dining room, "we thank you for the abundant blessings of this year, for love discovered and nurtured, for children born and growing, for the courage to be honest with ourselves and each other. We thank you for teaching us that the greatest gifts are not those found under trees, but those found in the daily choice to love and be loved fully." "Amen," came the chorus of voices around the table. But Catherine found herself particularly moved by the prayer that had once seemed impossible, gratitude for a love that had nearly been lost before it was found. After dinner, as was their custom, Theodore read the Christmas story from the family Bible while young Teddy sat on Catherine's lap, his small hands resting on her belly as if he could already sense his sister's presence. The words that had been spoken in that same room for 3 generations of Beaumonts carried new meaning now, spoken by a man who had learned that love required not just faith, but courage. Later, after their guests had departed and young Teddy had been tucked into his bed with visions of Christmas morning, dancing in his dreams, Catherine and Theodore sat together in their bedroom, exchanging the private gifts that had become their tradition. "For my beloved wife," Theodore said softly, placing a small wrapped box in Catherine's hands. Inside, nestled in white silk, was a locket of rose gold engraved with the date of their wedding renewal and containing a tiny photograph of young Teddy. But it was the inscription inside that brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "2 hearts, 1 love forever and always." "Theodore," she whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving. "Open it," he urged gently. The second compartment held not another photograph, but a small piece of parchment with Theodore's careful handwriting. "For our daughter, when she is old enough to understand. Your parents' love story began with fear and silence, but it bloomed into courage and joy. May you always know that love is a choice we make every day, and may you choose bravely." Catherine's tears flowed freely now, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude that came from being truly known and loved. "How did you know exactly what I needed?" "Because you're my heart," Theodore replied simply. "I know you because loving you has taught me to know myself." Catherine's gift to Theodore was smaller, but no less meaningful, a leather-bound journal filled with her own handwriting, documenting every moment of joy they had shared since their reconciliation. The late-night conversations, the morning walks in the garden, the quiet moments of understanding that had built their love day by day. "So we never forget," she said as he turned the pages with wonder, "how precious this happiness is. So we remember to choose each other every day, just as we did in the beginning." Theodore pulled her closer, mindful of their growing daughter, but unable to resist the need to hold his wife against his heart. "Catherine, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found our courage? If we had continued living as strangers?" "Sometimes," Catherine admitted, settling into his arms with the comfort of a woman who had found her perfect refuge. But then I remind myself that wondering about other paths is useless when the one we chose led us here. They talked quietly through the night, sharing dreams for their children, plans for their plantation, hopes for the future they were building together. As dawn approached on Christmas morning, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed designed to herald their daughter's approaching birth, Catherine felt the deep peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. "Theodore?" she whispered, as he began to drift towards sleep. "I love you, not because of what brought us together, not despite what kept us apart, but because of who we became when we finally had the courage to be real with each other." Theodore's arms tightened around her, and she felt him smile against her hair. "And I love you, Catherine Hamilton Beaumont, with every breath in my body and every dream in my heart, forever and always." As Christmas morning broke over Beaumont Manor, painting the cotton fields in golden light and filling the house with the laughter of young Teddy discovering his Christmas surprises, Catherine and Theodore lay wrapped in each other's arms, their love finally as sure and constant as the sunrise itself. They had learned that the greatest love stories are not written in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the quiet daily choices that build a life together. They had discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that love is worth more than fear. Most importantly, they had found that happiness is not a destination to be reached, but a journey to be shared with someone willing to walk beside you through all the seasons of life. Their daughter would be born into a world where love was both sanctuary and adventure, where her parents had proven that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings, and where she would learn from her very first breath that she was not just wanted, but celebrated, cherished, and loved beyond measure. And in the years to come, when young Rose Catherine Margaret Beaumont asked her parents to tell her the story of how they fell in love, they would share the truth that love is not always easy, but it is always worth fighting for. That the greatest victories are won not on distant battlefields, but in the daily choice to be vulnerable, honest and brave with the person who holds your heart. They would tell her that love stories don't always begin with love at first sight, but they can still end with love that lasts forever.